March 3rd, 2018, and today I'm going to begin a series on the cosmology of light. This series actually follows the completion of a 6-book series on the cosmology of light. And what I propose to do in this video series is essentially share some of the key concepts that run through this model of light. To begin with, today I'm going to share what I call the seed equation, and this seed equation exists in this model everywhere in everything, so that light is present in everything and everything is a result of light, if you will. So the seed equation essentially emanates from a reality of light where light is traveling at infinity, and I'm going to depict that by c to the base infinite, and let's assume a sphere and a source of light in the center. So since it's traveling at an infinite speed, what this implies is that light is going to be completely present in that sphere instantaneously. So there's this property of presence that exists. It also implies that if something were to arise within this sphere, then ultimately it's going to cede to the light that's present on all sides, and therefore there's this aspect or property of power. It also implies that this light, having a complete knowledge of itself and existing everywhere in that sphere, is going to have a complete knowledge of that sphere. So there's this aspect of knowledge. And it also implies that if anything that exists in here is going to be totally connected, or is going to exist in this fiber of light, and therefore there's this aspect of harmony. So if we were to summarize that, then we see that at C infinite, there's a reality that can be expressed as some kind of function of presence, power, knowledge, harmony. Now let's take the opposite of this. Now assume that light experiments and projects out of itself something of itself, but has the exact opposite properties. So in fact it's traveling at a speed of 0. So there's a source of light within a sphere, but traveling at a speed of 0, it can go nowhere. And so rather than a presence, there's a lack of presence, so there's an absence, or there's, we may call that a darkness. Instead of power, anything that arises around will continue to exist and persist, and so there's a complete weakness. Instead of knowledge, this light has no knowledge of anything in that sphere, so there's an ignorance. And instead of harmony, because anything that arises within that sphere can persist and almost randomly, there's a chaos. So what we have, if C were to project itself out at a 0 speed, you have a reality that's a function of darkness, weakness, ignorance, and chaos. And that's the exact opposite of light traveling at an infinite speed. But let's assume now that light projects itself out somewhere in between these two extremes at the speed that we know as c, which is 186,000 miles per second. The question is, what would the reality look like in this sphere that we live in? And we can generalize that being of a finite speed, therefore when light moves from, say, point A to B, let's assume we are somewhere on this stream of light, and we're sitting over here, and from here we can clearly see that there's a past, there's a present, and there's a future. And so the aspect of time becomes real. And further, what we also realize is that there's islands of matter, and there's a connection that exists between these various islands that have arisen within this space. So one can say that at the speed, I'm going to call the 186,000 miles per second as the untransformed layer, there is some kind of way to describe this as being having a past, a present, a future, and connection. But if we think about what past, present, future, and connection really mean, then the past is the result of everything that has already existed. So there's a kind of a stability or a physicality to it. So I'm going to call that a physicalness, or just being physical. And the present is a result of a number of forces vying for expression, so there's a vitality to it. The future is, in a sense, the result of some seed ideas, so there's some core ideas or a mentality to it, and the connection is some aspect of harmony. So somewhere over here, if we were to describe CU, then it's a function of this physical, vital, mental, and harmony that are aspects or properties of its reality. And further, we can see that there's a mapping between the physical and this aspect of presence, between the vital and this aspect of power, between the mental and the aspect of knowledge, and then connection and harmony. So what we're seeing is that there's some kind of a similarity that exists between these properties that are native to this reality at infinite speed of light and the reality at c at 186,000 miles per second. But we also know that at this reality over here, there's incredible amount of diverse material existence. So the question is, how from this reality that's animated by presence, power, knowledge, harmony, is this reality of a diverse material existence created? And mathematically, there can be a couple of transformations that allow this reality to become this reality. And let's assume that there's some layer, we'll call it K, so where light is traveling at a speed K, which is way higher than 186,000 miles per second, closer to infinite. And there's another layer N, where light is traveling less than K, but more than 186,000 miles per second. And let's see what kind of mathematical transformation would be required to basically translate this reality into this. And so we could posit that reality over here is a function of some large sets of presence. So I'll call it S, a set of presence, set of power, set of knowledge, and set of harmony, where we find seed elements that are variations of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony, essentially growing to infinite sets of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And so if you had some kind of a mathematical transformation that took this and created these sets, and then a further mathematical transformation that took these sets and created unique elements, the way we would depict this is it would be a function of the product of the set of power, presence, knowledge, and harmony. And what this implies is that there are infinite number of seeds that are combinations of these elements that all emanate from these sets that then become the basis for this incredible diverse material existence that we experience over here at this layer at which light is traveling at 186,000 miles per second. When we want to connect these layers together, essentially what we're saying is that the reality at CK is a function of the reality at C infinite. And then similarly, what we're saying is that the reality at Cn is a function of the reality at Ck. what we're saying here is that the reality at Cu is a function of the reality at Cn. So in a sense, this becomes, if you will, the seed equation, but at the same time, when we know that this reality that we existed has a kind of stubbornness of persistence, an urge where there is this darkness that may arise, and we can attribute it to the influence of this layer that exists also, that's the projection of this native layer into its opposite. And so we may also say that there's this influence where the reality at Cu is also a function of the reality at C0. And so what we have then is that reality at Cu is basically a function as described here and here. So it's a combination of these two influences. The seed equation, again, I would just summarize as being this matrix here, this light matrix, and in subsequent videos I'll expand this further to show how the seed equation actually creates matrices of time and space, and how the combination of this light time space matrix actually can model anything that we see around us, anything that we are, from the architecture of quantum particles to the architecture of complex sustainable civilization, and even anything that emerges within our human spheres. So for example, thoughts and sensations, wills, urges, emotions can all be seen to be also projections of these basically fundamental four properties that animate this whole seed equation in subsequent videos. Good morning, March 10th, 2018, and today I wanted to continue the exploration into some concepts of the cosmology of light. Last week I had introduced the notion of the seed equation, and today I want to focus on quantization. Now I'm going to use the seed equation to get into quantization, and recall from last week that we had posited a layer of reality where light is moving at an infinite speed, and said that in that reality we're going to have four properties of presence, power, knowledge, harmony, and those are implicit properties of light traveling at an infinite speed. Now we can think of that layer of reality as being a fundamental reality, the implication being that all other things are emergent from this. So any other phenomena that we experience and the infinite diversity of the world that we live in is emergent. Space, time, gravity, energy are all emergent, and I want to express how that is in this framework using quantization as a basis. So we had the reality at this innate layer of C traveling at an infinite speed, and we posed the question as to, at this layer where light is traveling at 186,000 miles per second, we have infinite material diversity, and there were four properties that also emanated in this field: the past, present, future, and connection between islands of matter, that we reduced to physical, vital, mental, and connection. And there was seen to be a one-to-one mapping between these four properties at light traveling at an infinite speed and these four properties of light traveling at 186,000 miles per second. So the question is, just mathematically, how can these four vast properties become this infinite diversity here? And so we had posited that this could happen if there were some intermediate layers of reality. So for example, a reality CK where light is traveling at a vaster speed, a much higher speed than 186,000 miles of k, and similarly Cn somewhere between Cu and Ck. And we had posited that at this layer of reality we could have sets of presence, set of power, set of knowledge, set of harmony, which are variations on these underlying qualities but containing an infinite number of elements related to presence, power, knowledge, harmony respectively. And further, that the elements of these sets could then interrelate to create a infinite number of unique seeds, and we had mathematically shown that or expressed that as the multiplication between the set of presence, set of power, set of knowledge, and set of harmony, and that essentially creates an infinite number of unique seeds that then become the basis of this infinitely diverse material reality. And we had posited a relationship between these different layers and just summarized that as being that the reality at Ck is basically a function of the reality at C infinity, and similarly reality at Cn is a function of the reality at Ck, and similarly the reality at Cu is a function of the reality at Cn, and this was referred to as the essence of the seed equation. Now, when we talk about wave-particle duality, what we're really saying in this framework is that the particle exists in this materially diverse environment. The wave, where light is traveling much faster, is this reality of the seeds. When light is traveling infinitely fast, there's a reality of a block, if you will, and at this layer of these vast sets there's a reality of fields that are created. And so essentially there's not a duality, but there's a block, field, wave, particle quadrality, and this quadrality is present in every single space-time instant of this layer. And the question is, how do those other layers that are behind relate or express themselves at this material layer? And that's where the notion of quantization comes in. So essentially what we're saying is that all possibility, all infinity exists at that native layer of light traveling at an infinite speed. So there's an immense codification at this layer, and as these other layers are created, this codification expresses itself through some kind of accumulation of its essence, and that accumulation of the essence is what we call quantization. So quantization in this view is, let's just create a general form. So if we call quantization Q and X being various kinds of quantization, then that really is a function of C at these different layers of reality. So let's just call that CY, impinging itself or expressing itself at this reality that we know as CU. So this is specific, where Y is any layer except for U, so it's any possibility except for U. And this is a specific form, but if we want to generalize it further, we can say QX is a function of CY impinging itself on CZ, and then this becomes a more general form for the various kinds of quantization that exist. When we think about quantization, we have what we call the Planck's constant H, and that expresses how energy accumulates and forms something tangible at this layer of C to the U. But if we think about quantization from a more abstract perspective and related to this cosmology of light in the seed equation, then essentially this layer here becomes critical. Now let's remember that this is the fundamental reality. Everything else is emergent. So emergent meaning that there has to be some kind of quantization in order that it can emerge. So if we look at this layer of infinite seeds just behind this material layer, then the infinite seeds, what we can posit is that space is itself, what we call space, what we experience as space, is a function of the infinite number of seeds that exist at this layer. We can think about time as being a function of the maturity of these seeds. So these seeds go through a process by which what is implicit in them becomes explicit, and there's a maturity, and that's what time is really telling us, is that process of maturity. Time is not an absolute time, it's a relative time, and it's in this framework, its fundamental determinant is the maturity of seeds. When we think about energy, what similarly we can posit is that it's a function of the materialization of seeds. And when we think about gravity, we can think about it as being a function of the collectivity of seeds. So here we have space-time, energy, gravity that we may think are fundamental qualities of our existence. In this view, they are emergent qualities, and they're emergent on this notion of seeds that express something of the codification of possibility that exists at this native layer of light. If you want to probe a little further, then we can further say that space, which is a function of seeds, is in fact a function of the underlying property of knowledge. So that's one of the fundamental properties of light. We can say that time and the maturity of seeds is a fundamental property of power, because there's an inevitability, no matter what the circumstance, that this will express itself, the maturity will express itself in time, and so it's a function of power. We can say that the energy, where you have the materialization of seeds taking place, is a function of presence, and similarly the gravity, which is a function of the collectivity of seeds, we can think about more fundamentally as a function of harmony. And so this notion, when we talk about Planck's constant, this really relates to this layer here, but if we want to get more general, then what this really implies is that this Planck's constant here should be h to the e for energy, or h to the pr for presence. Similarly, there would, I would argue, be another kind of quantization for time, which we can call h to the t, or h to the p for the power. And there's a different kind of quantization for space, which could be h to the s for space, or h to the k for knowledge. And similarly, I would argue that there's a quantization for gravity. So different kinds of seeds and the relationship of seeds have a different way of relating and interrelating with other possibilities, and this is specific to a collection of seeds. So that would be hg for gravity, or h to the h, base h for harmony. So we can see that just thinking about this layer itself, already we have four fundamental, if you will, constants for quantization. And similarly, it's possible that there are many, many different quantization constants as you think about the interrelationship between one layer and the other. And that's really what this general form here is getting to. Good morning, March 18th, and I want to continue with the exploration of cosmology of light, and today specifically explore the architecture of possibility. I'm going to build off the exploration of the last few weeks and essentially just recap the seed equation and recap the notion of quantization. But then I also want to look at, when we talk about the architecture of possibility, consider Schrodinger's equation, wave equation, and some other forms of it. So recall that the kind of root of the cosmology of light is when we consider light moving at an infinite speed, it gives rise to a reality which is pronounced by four principles, if you will: presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And when we consider light moving at 186,000 miles per second, that creates this reality. It creates a reality in which we have the physical, vital, mental, and connection. And we find that there's a symmetry between this depiction of reality and this depiction of reality, which gives insight into the notion of light when viewed from different points of view. And completing this notion of the seed equation, we can mathematically transform this reality into this reality, creating different views of this symmetry that underlies the properties in light. So if we consider an intermediate plane where light is moving at a speed k, and another plane where light is moving at the speed n, where n is between 186,000 miles per second and k is between n and an infinite speed, then essentially what we had posited was that at this k, we can have sets of presence, a set of power, set of knowledge, set of harmony, which would essentially be sets of infinite elements. And then at n, we have the basis of uniqueness, which is an infinite number of unique seeds that create the reality of the material diversity that we experience here. When light is traveling at 186,000 miles per second, we depict this infinite set of seeds just simply by the multiplication of these four sets: the set of powers, set of presence multiplied by set of power, multiplied by set of knowledge, multiplied by set of harmony. And then we had posited that essentially the reality at Cu is a function of the reality at Cn, and similarly the reality at Cn is a function of the reality at Ck, and similarly the reality at Ck is a function of the reality at C infinite. And this was the seed equation, and one of the characteristics of this is that whereas things show up materially at this layer U, we had posited that they show up as a wave here, as a field here, and as a block over here, essentially creating the paradigm that we have a quadrality that informs every space-time instant and not just a wave-particle duality. Now, when we talk about the architecture of possibility, we're essentially going to leverage off this equation here, and keeping in mind that this is considered to be reality, and this, everything else is emergent from this. So when we talked about quantization and essentially how things show up materially, there is a scheme of quantization whereby the layers of light behind can accumulate what the essence of is going to be expressed materially, and that accumulation of the essence is basically what results in quantization. So packets of light that then become matter, and we had also posited that quantization is a multidimensional scheme. It's not just about energy converting into matter, but there's also quantization along the space, time, gravity dimensions, in addition to the energy dimension that's already considered and has mathematically been equated to Planck's constant h. So we had posited from previous discussions that we have therefore multiple Planck's constants, a Planck's constant for space, a Planck's constant for time, for gravity, and of course what's already known as a Planck's constant for energy. Now this is in a sense how things materialize according to this scheme, but if we consider the prevalent view in quantum physics, then one of the first schemes is that of Schrodinger's equation, and here we have IH 2 pi and the rate of change, if you will, of psi that equals to the previous wave function times a focusing function, the Hamiltonian. And some of the key features of this are essentially you're connecting the material layer with some layers behind it, so being consistent with this scheme of multi-layers, there's, in this view, Planck's constant is emergent and is determined by the speed of light and the relation between layers of reality at different speeds of light and 186,000 miles per second. And when we're talking about a wave, we see here that h is being reduced by a fraction, which means that light is essentially traveling faster. So there's a consistency, if you will, between this framework and this framework. And then whatever manifests materially, so the rate of change of the manifestation is consistent or dependent on the previous or the entire possibility of the wave function that exists, which is essentially everything behind this material layer here. And this focusing function, Hamiltonian, is in a sense a function of these layers that exist behind this material layer. So that's one depiction of the architecture of possibility. Now when we talk about a second depiction of the architecture of possibility, it can be built of Euler's function. So we have EIX, so we may say that what manifests is a function of Euler's function, but let's explore this a little more. We know that e to the ix is depicted by cosine x I sine x, which when you look at it, it essentially describes a sinusoidal wave, and if you bound that within 0 and 1, you have all the possible probabilities adding up to 1, meaning that whatever is possible behind the surface, there'll be one thing that will manifest. And so here's another scheme of the architecture of possibility that's tied to probabilities. And if you want to elaborate this a little further, so we may say that psi is proportional to E. So we can, instead of using this notation of the rate of change of psi, we can use an integral notation, which means for all space and time, we add up all possibilities, and further, all those possibilities will kind of fluctuate between some bound, and we can depict that by another integral x. So we have this kind of second notation of the architecture of possibilities, and I want to explore a third notation that kind of builds on this. But here we're going back to the seed equation. When we speak about the seed equation, what we're talking about is the layers of reality that exist behind or inform this material layer of reality. And in order to kind of feel those layers or activate them in material existence, a way to think about it is that, so this describes some kind of a light matrix, but we could similarly have a space matrix in which these seeds that we had explored over here express themselves through some kind of a maturity in time, but the seeds exist as infinite variety in space, and we can depict this by saying that there's an untransformed layer in which there's many dynamics along 4 different dimensions. We depict that by a small x, where x really relates to this one of these 4 dimensions over here, and I've explored this in other videos, so I'm not going to go in detail over here, but it all comes down to a notion of breaking existing patterns that exist in this untransformed layer. When we break these patterns, that's depicted essentially by being able to exceed the patterns that exist along these dimensions. We break into another dimension, let's call it meta level 1, in which the dynamics are more to do with the signatures along these different dimensions, and then when these signatures become forces or become prevalent, we essentially break patterns that exist here to enter into this reality, in which the more fundamental sets, the properties in the sets, become more real. And when these sets tend to become integral, then we break the pattern, if you will, and enter into from M2 to M3. So moving from M1 to M2, these sets become forces. Moving from this layer to this layer, we break patterns so that these forces become more integral. And then essentially at this layer, we have entered into this fourfold ever-present quality that exists at every point, if you will. So we may just depict that as system X. So we have this scheme of the maturity of seeds, and we have also a matrix, I'll just call it time, that describes when these kind of layers, if you will, M3, M2, M1, and U become active. And we can propose in this layer that M3 is active for all time and beyond time. And again, I'm not going to go into the details here, but the question is, when is M2 active? And M2, we can propose, since it's the enhancements of these sets, that it certainly is active at a time greater than 0 and to infinity. And then M1, we can say, is active at a time later than this, because we're talking about the creation of unique seeds. So we may depict that at greater than or equal to time, the time over here, but also within the bound infinity. And the U, in terms of when does this layer become active, we may draw a separation between the reality of cellular life versus human life, and say that at human life, this notion of will and breaking patterns is more important. So time works in such a way that there's a maturity that works from U integrating into M3, and at the level of cell and before, we have the opposite dynamic, where there's an automaticity that expresses itself at this quote-unquote untransformed layer, so it moves in the other direction. So essentially, using this light space time matrix, we may modify this depiction here and say that the architecture of possibility is determined by this integral E, and then the integral LST, where LST represent the light space and time matrix, and essentially then all possibility fluctuates between these bounds from 0 to 1 from a probabilistic scheme, but is determined by the dynamics of these layers here. But I would argue that there's a simpler way to depict the architecture of possibility, this kind of movement from Schrodinger's equation to taking Euler's and Pythagoras' theorem, if you will, to depict probabilities, to this notion is all kind of developed from Schrodinger's equation. But if, however, you take this light space and time matrix and you allow it to iterate so that you have here at the untransformed layer some kind of set that is relatively untransformed, but through the action of these components here, there's some kind of a transformation and it becomes relatively transformed, then you can iterate this whole thing so that the next xu that you iterate is basically derived from the previous xt, and we can depict that through this. So essentially this means that there's an iterative function in which the basis of materialization is more advanced than it was previously. And in this kind of depiction, there's probably a fourth scheme that would summarize the architecture of possibility, and that we could simply, we may call it emergence, is equal to basically the product of the light space time matrix that is iterated such that xu becomes is based on the previous xt, and this whole thing is iterated such that n proceeds from some constant, say from 1 to infinity. So that's another way to really depict the architecture of possibility. April 2nd, 2018, and I'd like to specifically speak about the integration of relativity with quantum theory using the framework of the cosmology of light that I've been exploring over the last few weeks. So I'm going to start by summarizing the seed equation, and in the seed equation there's a process of quantization that happens, and this quantization is a fourfold quantization, and so there's a modification to quantum theory, and based on that modification, essentially that forms the basis for integrating relativity, special relativity, general relativity with quantum theory. And so that's what I want to explore. So I'm going to recap the seed equation, and I'm going to do so quickly. One can always refer to previous videos to look at it in more detail. So if light is traveling at an infinite speed, then what we have is a reality that's has properties of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. Now, when we have light traveling at c, which is 186,000 miles per second, then we have a reality of the physical, vital, mental, and connection. And there's a symmetry between the four properties here and here. But further, as we know, in this material layer of existence, there's infinite diversity. So just mathematically, the question is, how does this unity become the infinite diversity that we experience? And so we had proposed a couple of mathematical transformations related to the speed of light. And so we have light traveling at a speed greater than c but less than infinity, and let's depict that by k, so a reality set up by light traveling at the speed of k. Then we had proposed that essentially that creates a number of fields, and these fields expand out the possibilities existing in the fourfoldness of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. So we have a set of presence, we have a set of power, set of knowledge, set of harmony, that has many elements that create, in a sense, independent fields. Now we have further a reality set by light traveling at n being higher than c but less than k. And here, essentially, there is a combination of the different elements of the four sets that create unique seeds that manifest as waves. And we can depict this mathematically as a multiplication of the set of presence times the set of power times the set of knowledge times the set of harmony. And further, as one layer of a light relates to the other, there's a process of quantization that happens. To simplify, we're just going to consider the quantization between this layer N and C, since this is concerned with the layer of infinite seeds and how they relate to this material layer here. We can think of this whole notion as the seed equation or the light matrix, and exploring further this notion of quantization as it relates to the seeds. So we can think of, if we think about this layer of seeds, then we can think of space as basically being a function of the number of seeds, but the seeds themselves depict different kinds of archetypes, and so we can think of that as a function of light's property of knowledge. Similarly, when we think about time, it's a function of the maturity of seeds, and we can think of that as a function of light's property of power. And when we think about gravity, we can think of that as a function of the collectivity of seeds, and that in itself is a function of light's property of harmony. And when we think of energy, that's a function of the materialization of seeds, and we can think of that as a function of light's property of presence. So as in this first kind of quantization happens between this layer and this layer, it automatically creates these emergent realities of space, time, gravity, and energy. So the important point here is that if we were to consider what absolute reality is, then we may say that it's when light travels at an infinite speed, and then everything else is emergent. And in particular, as these vast set of seeds materializes at this material plane, in that process, the materialization itself creates space, time, gravity, and energy. Now, we had also explored earlier an equation for the seed, for the uniqueness of every seed, and so I'm going to relate these four emergent properties of space, time, gravity, and energy in terms of the equation for the seed that we had derived earlier. And just to summarize, the seed, I'll depict that by I, c to the base I, was equal to ax plus by, where this element can repeat itself from 0 to n times with a different b and a different y, but let me explain that. So we have where x and y are both elements of the set of presence, the set of power, the set of knowledge, and the set of harmony, but a and b are integers where a is basically greater than b. And so we would have a unique seed in which you would have a primary element and then a number of secondary elements, and that would uniquely define a vast number of seeds that would then become the basis for the materialization at this layer over here. Now, when we think about the fourfold quantization along the space-time gravity and energy dimensions, we may summarize this as the quantization along the space dimension as essentially being some Planck's constant, and here related to the way that knowledge manifests at this untransformed layer. So I'm referring to this layer where light's traveling at c as untransformed. I refer to this layer as metal layer 1, metal layer 2, and this layer where light travels at infinity at metal level 3. So we have basically some quantization constant times the seed k, since space is related to k in this scheme of things. Similarly, we have the quantization for time, where you have a Planck's constant related to power and multiplied by the seed for power. We have quantization of gravity, which is related to a Planck's constant of harmony times a seed of harmony. And then we have quantization at the energy level, where a Planck's constant related to presence and a seed for presence. So this defines a fourfold quantization, and now I want to use essentially these derived equations to look at a number of physical situations and explain them in terms of this fourfold scheme of quantization. So I'm going to consider a situation of at the level of atomic particles, at the level of unit space, at the level of a complex planet like Earth, at the level where a particle approaches the speed of light c, and then also I'm going to consider situations where general relativity is known to play in, such as the black hole and a cosmic bounce. So let's first consider this atomic space, and I'm going to refer to, so the essential, what I'm trying to draw insight into is how this quantization is going to happen between this layer here of infinite seeds and this material layer here based on this fourfold scheme of quantization. So I'm going to refer to the quantization as big Q, and then for at the atomic particle level, so just atomic particle, and I'm going to relate it to this fourfold scheme of quantization just pictorially. So we have space, time, gravity, and energy, and all things being equal, what we're suggesting is that the quanta, if you will, is a result of the equally of these four different dimensions here. So I'll depict that just graphically as the quanta being at this atomic particle level being something like this. Now when we think of a larger space, and I'll call that unit space, US for unit space, we would expect that would be some kind of at least a sigma of the the quantization at the atomic particle level, and so we could depict that as space, time, gravity, and energy. And the rationale here is that if we have a single material seed over here that's manifesting, that manifestation has different components to it. There's the way that it shows up in space, then there's the way it matures in time, the way it may interact with other seeds, and the way that it materializes. So there is a basic fourfold quantization, and over here, if this quantization at the atomic particle level is here, then unit space that consists of perhaps many different material seeds, it could be just some kind of a transformation of this so that it's larger. So we would expect it to be a sigma of this, so it's simply related in this kind of manner. Now if we consider something a little more complex, so a planet such as Earth, so I'll just call that a big planet, a quanta big planet. So how does this scheme of large number of seeds materialize on a planet like Earth? then we would expect it would be some kind of sigma of all the seeds that exist on planet Earth. So certainly a unit space. But however, there's one kind of complication that sets in, since we're speaking about a number of irreversible processes that happen when these different seeds and the maturity of the seeds happen. So time is going to get elongated disproportionately. So if we consider this to be a unit space, the quanta of a unit space, and then if we look at, again, the space-time, gravity, energy, then what we may expect is that there's an elongation as things work themselves out in longer time. So this would be kind of how that cumulative or composite quanta looks like. So there'd be two components. There's the summation of the quantum at unit space, and this is modified by the quanta of time, which is depicted by this. So this is kind of like what this composite quanta would look like. Now let's step up a level of complexity and consider what would happen as, say, a set of particles approach the speed of light. So I'll just call that Q particle. So we're looking at the composite quanta as particles approach the speed of light. And considering the same scheme here, space, time, gravity, energy. Now, a way to think about this is from the point of view of an observer who's seeing these particles. And in the observer space, there's a huge number of these seeds, but in the observed space, there's much fewer seeds, so space is compressed. The maturity of these seeds is compressed, so time kind of slows down or is compressed. Gravity is compressed, but since you've got velocity that's now approaching the boundary between this layer and this layer, the composite quanta is going to change along this dimension, and the energy or mass is going to increase tremendously, and that can be depicted as a composite quanta of this nature here, which is essentially looking at special relativity from the point of view of how these different seeds interact and work themselves out. Now, if we consider a situation of general relativity, say of a black hole, so what's the composite quanta at the level of a black hole? And again, thinking about these four dimensions of quantization, then we know that in a black hole there's a compression of matter, and basically we can hypothesize that those seeds break down and perhaps create a smaller set of much more complex seeds. The way we would depict that is that there's a modification. So if we think about the composite particle, rather quanta for a black hole, then there's a modification along the space dimension, the quantization dimension, which is, if we use this equation here, we have HUK, but then there's a sigma of the seeds along the knowledge dimension. So there's a modification here. If we think about, so there's a compression, so if we think about, say, the unit space as being just invoking this one here, and then relatively, let's just say that there's a compression of the space, and then if we think about time, so now we have this modified seed which is going to play out and mature differently, and so there's a modification along the time dimension, and that's using this equation here, where you have Planck's constant related to power, and then a sigma related to power. So the time is going to basically expand out, and then you have a modification along the gravity dimension, which is known to be much greater, or hypothesized to be much greater due to the vast number of seeds that now come into a smaller seed. So we can depict that by the modification that happens along that harmony dimension, and then similarly there's a modification along the quantization for energy, which we would hypothesize is also a new kind of energy. And so this is what this kind of composite quanta might be here. And so we're looking at this composite quanta that has some kind of graphical shape like this. Now let's consider the last situation of a cosmic bounce, where you have hundreds of billions of basically stars converging in, galaxies and stars converging in to one point. And in this situation, we may hypothesize that it would be related to this. So we have the cosmic bounce, and the question is, how does the rematerialization occur once those seeds all come together? And if we use this as a basis over here, the composite quanta at the black hole, and just depict that by this kind of scheme, then basically what I would hypothesize is that you would have a composite quanta that had a lower space dimension but then much higher on the energy, time, and gravity dimensions, which would set up a new kind of physical dynamics for a re-expanding universe. And we would take basically these four equations, I'll just say QBH, but then we would expect to be much larger, and I'll just use exponential by a huge factor m to specify this quantum cosmic bounce, which is related to the composite quanta of a black hole times some massive multiplication. So essentially, just stepping back, what we're saying is that there's now a way to, using this scheme here, the framework of cosmology of light, where there's a fourfold quantization, to look at different kinds of physical situations that occur or that have been hypothesized, and kind of explain them or understand what might happen physically based on this theory. And so in a sense, the basic mathematics that's depicted here, I would say, can be built on to create further this integration of a modified quantum theory and relativity.